Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at setting up a campfire with FumeFX 5, and we're going to look through most of the other UI options that we didn't catch in the first video. To get started, what we're going to do is we're going to add these logs into our FumeFX simulation. First we're going to need to create a grid. We'll create that, and as we did before, we're going to go in and we're going to adjust the size. Something like 30 by 30 by 30 should work out okay. Now this is really low resolution. We'll at least bring it down to half, which is still very low resolution, but it's going to allow us to iterate through our scene very quickly. The next thing we're going to do is add our logs as an object to emit fluids into this grid. So we're going to select the logs and select the FumeFX grid and go up here to the toolbar and say create object source. And of course this is going to create that object source, and it's going to put the campfire geometry in there. Let's take a look at this object source. In an object source, similar to a simple source, you can have it emit fuel, oxygen, temperature, smoke, and it has some options for velocity and turbulence as well. If we just go and simulate, we should be able to see something now. So I'm going to move our simulation info window out of the way, and let's go and take a look at the GPU display. So you can see that we have some smoke and fire coming into play. It's definitely getting cut off at the top. So let's remedy that right now. We're going to go and stop our simulation. Over in general, we can scroll up and we can see that we can set our boundless to be on Z, and we'll leave it at all fields for right now. And that should now encompass the rest of this. This is also not happening quite fast enough. So let's go over to our simulation tab. And there's a nice parameter for time scale. Campfires like this kind of move pretty fast, so let's set that to something like 2.5. This is a good parameter to maybe set as you get started because it does change a lot of the other parameters you might tweak. So let's see if we kind of have the speed that we're looking for. So as this goes through, you can see that it's working out pretty well. We kind of have the speed that we're looking for, but there's a couple of other parameters that we want to adjust. The first thing that I would say is I'd like these flames to be a little higher. First thing I'm going to do is go into Object Source and set that up. As far as fuel goes, actually, I want a little bit less fuel, so I'm going to set that to 25, and I want the temperature to be a little bit lower. I also actually don't want the smoke set from here. If I just go and just disable the fuel, you can see that all the smoke is getting generated directly from the logs. And we have an option to actually generate the smoke from the fire itself, and that's what we're going to use because I think that's a little more realistic. So let's disable smoke and enable our fuel. And then let's go to our simulation. We're going to go down and choose Fire Create Smoke and set the smoke density to 10. Now let's take a look at what we have. We have some fire and we have some smoke, but the fire is kind of struggling to get going here, and that's because of the ignition temperature. So let's drop the ignition temperature down, and we're also going to drop the burn rate down. I'll set it to maybe to something like 7. A lower burn rate allows the fuel to burn longer, and that'll make your flames a little bit taller. Now we can see we're getting a lot larger flames, and the smoke is getting generated from the flames themselves, which is really nice. Now as I do this, I'm going to turn on an option over here. That option is Simulation Loop. Now this is really nice because basically when it gets to the end of the timeline, it'll keep simulating and we can kind of tweak some parameters here. I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, whenever you do reduce the burn rate, it can be good to increase maybe the expansion a bit. So maybe I'll set that to 2. And even the heat production, I'll set that to 20. So I kind of doubled them both, and that'll give me a little bit more of a robust flame. Now I don't think I need this much smoke, but let's just take a look at the smoke in the render. In order to see the smoke clearly, we're definitely going to have to add in our light. So under the Illumination tab, let's just choose our light, and that's going to add that in there. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our Rendering tab, and we're going to scroll down to Smoke. And the first thing we're going to set is that we want to cast and receive shadows, and you can even see this kind of update here in the viewport. So now we can see that we have shadows cast and received on that smoke. So it's going to get a bit brighter, but you can see kind of what's happening here. Now this smoke is way too thick, and we'll probably adjust that a little bit later. That's pretty easy to do via the opacity, and I do like to have the smoke there just in case an art director or somebody says, okay, we want to pump up that smoke. If we haven't simulated it, there's not much we can do. But if we have, and then we bring down the opacity with either the value or with a graph, then we still have that smoke there that we can play with. Let's take a look at tuning the look of our fire, and then we'll look at the look of our smoke. We can just uncheck the smoke here in the render tab, and then we can go in and start to adjust our fire. So for the fire, I'm going to go and I'm going to add a kind of gradient here. So I'm going to right click and say key mode, and that's going to allow us to have a gradient. And we can even see this here in the viewport. So we can see as we start to adjust this, we're going to get some different values. I like to kind of start with some darker values in the orange and kind of yellow range, and maybe some brighter values too that are a little bit more saturated, but getting a little bit of contrast in there. Bring that down to something like this, and maybe just bring it down to kind of something dark there. So you can see by adjusting the color, we're getting a lot more detail into our fire. Now this is a very low-res simulation anyways, but you can see that we're getting a lot more detail in there. Probably suggest we want a harder color in the middle there, and after a little tweaking we get something like this. So that's looking pretty nice for now, especially for a low-res simulation. Let's turn on our smoke. For the smoke, what we can do is kind of the same thing. We can bring up our gradient and we can start adjusting it. So let's just look at that smoke in the scene, and we can start playing with the dark areas or the light areas. Probably make it a little bit more of a dark fall off towards the right here. Maybe move that in. We really don't need that much smoke, but it is nice to have some variation in places. So after I added a couple of keys, we have something like this, and let's just render that out. You can see we still have some nice smoke in here. If we want to pare it back, we can. If we want to add in a little bit more, we can, because we can always adjust that opacity overall or using a AFC graph. What I could do is just say, you know what, overall, I'd like less of that smoke, and just crank it way down, or if we need some more, we can pump it way up. So that gives us some good control over our smoke. We'll leave it at 1, and we'll move along. To break up the flames a bit, we're going to add in our space warp. So let's go into Objects and Sources, and just choose the little plus sign here, and let's pick our wind. This is going to allow us to have our flames break up and get a little bit of windy turbulence. You can kind of see the setup that we have here. It's pretty low strength with some pretty low turbulence as well, but it should break up our flames nicely. When we go back into the Simulation tab and we look under our fuel settings, we can see if there are any more changes that we really want to set up here, and it looks pretty good. What we want to do is get set up for what we're going to add in Wavelet Turbulence. Wavelet Turbulence is going to add more detail to our simulation, as well as some nice kind of small turbulence as far as smoke and fire kind of curling, which is going to work pretty well. And what we want to do is we want to do our default simulation at a fairly low res, but we can bump up the quality. This is a good area to adjust your quality. So the default is 5 and it goes to 10. We'll maybe set our quality to 8 so we get a little better quality out of that simulation. And we'll leave the spacing, I guess, at 0.5. Now when we do go over to Wavelet Turbulence, one thing we're going to want to do is go down to the extra detail rollout here in simulation, and we're going to want to check Wavelet Turbulence. This is nice because it automatically adds our channels that we need, velocity and extra detail. Just so that I have a little bit of extra options when I simulate, I am going to add temperature as well. If I have that set up, one thing that I want to do is I want to take a look at these boundaries. If I'm going to add in wind, I'm going to have this kind of blowing from left to right. So on X, I'm going to set this to both. And then I actually want to set my sensitivity maybe down to the smoke. This way I can kind of use that smoke as a cutoff for my grid size. Let's take a look at what we have so far. So if I select this and I go over into our viewport and say I don't want to hide that home grid, you can see how far up this smoke goes. And for our basic simulation as well as the Wavelet Turbulence situation, that's going to be probably a bit too big. It's way outside of our camera. So we'll just run this simulation and we can see where our grid is going to get cut off. So we're basing it on the smoke, and we can see the smoke kind of come through. Now we can see how the wind is blowing our fire and smoke, which is great. And as I go through here, I'm going to increase this threshold maybe to 2. So we start cutting that smoke off. Probably go even a little bit more aggressive. Let's try 4. And we want to look in here, but we also want to look here to make sure we're not losing anything in the frame. Try and go with 6. And you can see that's cutting off our smoke, but it's nowhere that's really important to us in our shot. Alright, let's go up to 8. And simulating at a low res here to do this is really pretty useful. We'll set it to 7 and we can redo our simulation. We'll turn off simulation loop and just simulate all the way through. So now we have all of our channels that we want. We have the wind in there, and we'll simulate that through, and then we can pass it to the wavelet simulation. Okay, now that we've simulated that through, we can do a little play blast. So I might just go to Tools, grab Viewport, and say Create Animation Preview. Here's our preview animation. We can kind of see the speed and what's going on with our fire. In looking at the preview animation, I am going to go over to the Simulation tab, and I'm going to reduce the vorticity a bit to 0.2. I think that's going to help break up our flames a bit and not have it so erratic. So I'm going to redo the simulation pretty quickly. Now you can see we get a lot more breakup out of this than we had before by reducing that vorticity strength. And we don't really need as much of that vorticity strength because we're going to add in a little bit more detail with Wavelet Turbulence anyways. We also reduce that smoke so that we don't really have quite as much of it because we don't really need that much in a fire. So let's go over and set our Wavelet Turbulence. We're going to go to the Wavelet Turbulence tab, and we're going to set the input cache to be the default cache and the mode to be Wavelet Turbulence. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at this default cache, which we already simulated out, and it's going to run a wavelet simulation on it. There's not much we need to add here. We have the Wavelet Turbulence set to a value of 2, which means it's going to double the resolution. And you can see that here. We're at 120 by 120 by 120. And we could probably even pump that up to 4 or 3. I'll set it to 3. And then the strength of the Wavelet Turbulence. A strength of 2 will be good for our simulation, so we'll leave it at the default. And all we have to do is press play. So now we've gone through and we've run the wavelet simulation, and we should be able to see the difference here in the viewport. So as I scrub through, we're still playing back that default simulation, which looks pretty nice. But if we go from input into our wavelet cache from our default cache, then our viewport will update so we see the wavelet cache. And you can really see that detail when we toggle back and forth between those two caches, between the lower res default cache and the higher res wavelet cache. We get a lot of those details, the kind of the fire licks and curls, as well as for the smoke that come through. And in general, it's a higher resolution grid, which is really nice. If we do a quick render here, we can see what we're talking about. See, we're getting a lot more detail in our smoke as well as our fire. In general, it's the same basic shape, which is one of the things I really like about using Wavelet Turbulence. You can kind of get your form and shape and timing down, and then get some better resolution by doing a resim with Wavelet Turbulence. We could probably use to maybe turn down this smoke now that we have a little more detail in it as well for the final render. But let's take a look at a screen grab. So let's go in and do a preview animation. You can see that we get a lot more detail out of that simulation, some nice curling in both the smoke and the fire, and overall better result. Now if we're happy with this, we can do some final tweaks to our rendering. We'll just kind of keep this frame here, I guess. And one thing I wanted to look at is under illumination. If we're using scanline, we can choose multiscatter. So multiscatter will generate some lights, and it's going to introduce some illumination into the fire and or smoke. So I think maybe we'll just try it with the default here. Let's do a quick render. And you can see overall we have a little bit more kind of pumped up and brighter smoke as well as fire. What I kind of like to do is probably just turn off the smoke strength, and I'll crank up the fire strength a little bit so that it bleeds into the smoke a bit. Let's take a look at that. Here you can see that warm color start to bleed into the smoke, which is nice. Finally, I'd say that if I go into rendering, I like to remove a bit of that smoke because I think it's too present. So we can go down in here. Maybe we can adjust in our graph. We'll take a look in the viewport here. So we're going to go to one end and just start to bring that down. And that's looking pretty good. It might be a little hard to see in the viewport, but in the render I can see that I still have some smoke, and I've kind of attenuated it down a bit so that it's not overpowering. Alright, so there we go. In this video we took a look at tweaking our simulation settings so that we can get and tune our simulation for a nice campfire. We went in to adjust our render settings as far as colors and opacities of both the fire and smoke. We added in our light so that we can get illumination on our smoke and turned on those shadows for that smoke. And we also played with the multi-scattering to get a little bit more light coming from the fire onto the smoke. And we added in our objects and sources, of course, to emit from a mesh object and to add in a space warp for our wind. Now there's a lot more that we can do to tweak this to make it look much more realistic, but this is a good basis to really get you started with FumeFX.